Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center and to today's convenings of America's Town Hall. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president and CEO of this wonderful institution. And let's inspire ourselves, as always, for the conversation ahead by reciting together the National Constitution Center's mission statement. Here we go. The National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the U.S. Constitution among the American people on a nonpartisan basis. Before we start, I want to plug two upcoming programs. On Monday, we host a program exploring state constitutions, and we will talk about the 50th anniversary of the Virginia Constitution, as well as state constitutions today with Dick Howard, Emily Zakin, and Judge Jeffrey Sutton. And then on July 8th, we have our annual Supreme Court review. Just today, the Supreme Court handed down a really interesting free speech decision, and we will have so much to discuss with our partners at the ADL and the great panelists, Erwin Chemerinsky, Paul Clement, Fred Lawrence, and Melissa Murray, moderated by Dahlia Lithwick. We'll take your questions throughout the program today, so please put them in the chat box. And now let's begin. I'm so excited to co-host this series of programs with our friends at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. This has been such a meaningful series of conversations about how to restore the guardrails of democracy with our friends at SNF Agora. It's made possible with the support of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, and I want to thank the SNF Agora Institute team for their great collaboration. And it's a special thrill to welcome today the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute. We're honored to be joined by Hahrie Hahn. In addition to directing SNF Agora, she's a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. She directs the P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins, and her forthcoming book, co-authored with Elizabeth McKenna and Michelle Oyakawa, is Prisms of the People, Power, and Organizing in the 21st Century. And we're also honored to be joined by Dan McLaughlin, who's a senior writer at National Review Online. He has been a contributing editor of Red State, a columnist at The Federalist and the New Ledger, and was also an attorney for many years. And we're really honored to have you, Hahrie Hahn and Dan McLaughlin. Our topic today is, should more power be returned to the people? And it's an important question as part of our Guardrails of Democracy initiative, because before deciding how to restore the guardrails of democracy that have been eroded by polarization and technology, we have to define what democracy is and what it seeks to do. Democracy is ruled by the people, but how should the people rule? In what capacities, and should more power be returned to them? That's the subject of your important new book, Hahrie. So why don't you start us off by giving us a sense of the thesis of your new book, which argues that we need to focus not only on who has power, but we have to invest in institutions of civil society through which people develop the capacities of democratic life. And you also say that reformers have to strengthen organizations through which people can exercise their power to act as a countervailing force to corporations and the state. Tell us more about the important arguments of Prisms of the People.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I'm really looking forward to talking about these really important ideas with you and with Dan today. So to start, the book, maybe I'll give you a little bit of background on how we got into the book. My co-authors and I really started working on the book several years ago when we began to observe this pattern that's true across a lot of domains in American politics, which is that essentially the link between people's participation and political influence was broken, especially for people at lower income levels. And so whether you're sort of working class, lower class, or middle class, we saw that the link between participation and power was broken. And that's a pretty robust pattern across lots of different issue areas across American politics. And the first question to ask, in a sense, might be, well, why is that problematic? Why would we care? And I think there are a couple ways to think about this question. The first is, there are some who might argue that democracy itself, the legitimacy of democracy itself, depends on consent of the governed. That for a project of self-government to be successful, that government has to secure consent of the governed, and that people have to feel like there are mechanisms through which their views or their preferences get translated into political influence over the outcomes they care about the most. And we were seeing that pattern was becoming increasingly less likely for more and more people as patterns of inequality began to rise in American politics. And so that's one view that we might take. Another view that we might take is that whether or not, some people might argue that democracy as the sort of legitimacy argument isn't necessarily the most important one, that instead we might think about any project of self-government as really being about trying to protect people's liberties and trying to protect people's willingness and ability to engage in both the rights and the responsibilities of self-government. And I think that as we were coming into this project, we felt like one of the things that we've learned from a lot of research, not only our own, but other people's, is that the ability of government to be this safeguard against liberty depends critically on people's ability to sort of negotiate equal spheres of influence in which they can accept the liberty not only of themselves, but also of other people. Then in any kind of pluralistic, heterogeneous society, you have to have this ability for people to sort of negotiate that sphere of influence. And without that ability, then people's commitment to the project begins to decline. And one of the things that we are seeing in these patterns is that people's notions of representation in general, where the link between people and their government had become so thin that a lot of people felt like they didn't really have voice in over the outcomes they cared most about. And so what we want to set out to do in this book is really try to understand, well, where are the outliers? Even if we look at the aggregate data and we see that this pattern is a pattern that we see across lots of different areas in American politics, what if we were studying the outliers, the places where there were organizations that were able to break through, that were able to sort of create a situation where it felt like people could be architects of their own future. And that's where we came to the argument about prisms. And we use the metaphor of a prism because a prism, as you all know, takes white light in, and based on the design at the heart of the prism, it sort of transforms that white light into a vector of colorful light that comes out the other side. And part of what we argue is that the kinds of organizations that we need to invest in that repair this representative link in American democracy act like prisms, in the sense that they take people and their actions in, and through the work of what goes on in the organization, they're able to translate that into influence and power over the outcomes that people care most about. And I think one of the more counterintuitive findings that we found in the book is that often it feels like there's some well-founded, I think, concern about activists in American politics and the ways in which they might actually be harming some of the project of American democracy, because they pull people to further extremes by trying to advocate for specific views that they want to advocate. And I think part of what we found is that in these organizations that were acting like prisons, where people were developing the capacities and the skills and the motivations they needed to engage in the political process themselves, that people were more likely to commit to the project of democracy itself, which meant that they were more likely to commit to the kind of outcomes of pluralism, the recognition that there's both victory and loss for any side that gets involved in the process. And so the irony, in a way, is that what we found is that by engaging people in action in ways that allow them to feel like they have more agency, that they can put their own hands on the levers of change, that people become more committed to the system itself. Even if that means they're not always going to win, because the system, it makes people feel like the system is working and gives them an opportunity to shape whatever outcomes might come their way. And so a lot of what we try to unpack in the book is then, how do you construct the kind of organizations that allow people to feel like they're putting their hands on the levers of change? And we're hoping that by renewing more of those kinds of organizations, that you begin to see a proliferation of more people in society that feel like they can have that capacity.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for explaining the argument so clearly, and for arguing that to repair the broken link in American democracy, we need to cultivate organizations that act like prisms, so that people are more committed to the outcome of democracy, which includes the recognition that there's victory and loss. Dan McLaughlin, in your article, What is Democracy For Anyway?, you argue that the founding fathers had seen enough of assemblies and mobs to know the difference between thoughtful deliberation and the protection of fundamental rights. You say our system of government was designed by the founders not to stop the majority, but to slow it down. So it is time to think things through. We trust nobody to overrule a majority except for a larger prior majority. And you say the framers created a series of speed bumps and sobriety checkpoints. Here, the people rule. All we ask is that they act as if they do. Tell us more about your argument about why you think the founders were trying to slow down deliberation to promote thoughtful democracy and to protect liberty.
Yeah, so I mean, I go back to the founding. I mean, when you think about it, the United States at its founding was democratic in the sense that, the people, or at the time really a subset of the people, chose the government and the government was accountable to them. It was republican in the sense that there was no king, no hereditary nobility exercising hereditary powers. Liberal in the classical sense of guarding individuals' liberties, and constitutional in the sense that the government was constrained by a written document. And very few of the world's governments up to that point in time had been any of those things. They often had failed. The founders were well aware that democracy had failed in ancient Greece, that the republic had failed in ancient Rome, that contemporaries like the Polish state were being pulled apart at the time that they were writing. And so, they launched this incredible experiment to do all four of those things at once. And for the first roughly 75 years of American history, they were still essentially the only country on the planet that was simultaneously democratic, republican, liberal, and constitutional. And yet, today we have the oldest constitution in the world. The great majority of the world's people live under governments that at least make some pretense to being all four of those things. And even in places like Russia and China that really kind of don't, they've at least experimented with them at some point in their history. And so how did that work? How did this great experiment overcome history? Well, one way, of course, the one element that the founders added to the mix was separation of powers. And that was not just horizontal separation of executive, legislative, and judicial, but vertical separation between federal, state, and local. So essentially, when you cross those two things, you have 9 different centers of power. And the advantage for the people wanting change, of course, is that you could go to any one of those centers of power and move the ball a bit. But the safeguard was that any one of them, perhaps depending on the issue, could slow things down. But the other element that the framers added was deliberation. They understood that, deliberation, if you think about it, is the difference between a lynch mob and a jury. It may be the same people. They may be assembled for the same purpose, to locate the offender and punish a crime. And yet the process that we have in a courtroom is a process of deliberation that forces people to slow down, to work under certain rules, to think things over before they act. And so, many of the things that we find frustrating in our democratic system today, such as the way in which the Senate in particular moves slowly, were designed in order to say to the people, if you look at the system, right, the president, the Senate, and the House are all elected by different electorates on different schedules. And so in order to build a true governing majority at the federal level, and this is to some extent true at individual state levels, you need a sustained majority, a majority that lasts over a certain period of time, and inevitably that involves unwieldy coalitions of people who are, trading different favors, people who are compromising their most extreme stances. And in order to pass laws, you need to have 60 senators, for example, today. That means 2/3 of the states at a minimum, or 60% of the states at a minimum. And so, there were a lot of things that were built into the system with the recognition that, you don't want necessarily everything that the people want at a particular moment, a particular fraction of the people to happen. You want them to have, you want people to have to work together over time. And frankly, one of the things that our system does is that people who are in the majority, even in a large majority, as to one part of the system, may be in the minority in another. If you are, for example, if you live in Benny Thompson's district in Mississippi, right, which is a majority Black district. And so you now are, and you're a Democratic voter, you are very much in the minority in your state government, in your senators, in the electoral college, the way your state votes. But at the same time, you're represented by a member of the House majority. You are represented by a president you voted for. And so, you know, even when we have unified partisan government at the federal level, you have an awful lot of people who are in a minority in one part of the government and a majority in another. And so that does impose a moderating influence.
Thank you very much for that. Hahrie, Dan has clearly stated a classical understanding of Madisonian constitutionalism. It contains, as he says, republicanism, democracy, liberalism, and constitutionalism. And the founding fathers relied on separation of powers and deliberation to slow down popular democratic majorities, not to prevent the majority from ruling, but refining popular opinion through a series of different institutions so that reason rather than passion could prevail. Do you disagree with the Madisonian framework as Dan has outlined it, or do you believe that focusing on institutions as prisms can help refine and slow down deliberation while at the same time empowering people and making them feel like their voices are being heard?
Yeah, no, I think Dan makes a really important point about the way in which separation of powers and deliberation was originally built into our Madisonian system. And, you know, in fact, often when I teach, you know, introduction to American politics or something like that to my students, one of the things that I say is that it intentionally was not built for efficiency, right? The system is not set up to allow for the quickest, most efficient outcomes, with the idea being that you want to have lots of opportunities along the way for a variety of different majority or minority groups to be able to object and slow down the process to ensure that we get the best outcome that we can have. So I certainly agree with that interpretation. I think that the part of the challenge that you know, I'd like for us to think about is this challenge of, you know, what do we need to sort of complement the structure of institutions to make them operate in the ways that we want them to operate? And one of the, you know, kind of quotes that I like to say sometimes is that I think sometimes people have this assumption that, you know, just because we build it, people will come. And I think a lot of the things that we've learned in American history is that's not necessarily true, that often people don't use the institutions the way that they were necessarily originally designed. You know, one example of that, for example, is the opening of the presidential primary system, you know, was really created in the late 1960s, early 1970s, in both the Republican and the Democratic Party as a reaction to wanting to allow for a broader range of voices to be involved in the nomination process for the presidential candidate of each party. And what ended up happening is that the way that those sets of reforms have been used is that actually it's almost has effectively narrowed the kind of voices that are involved in selecting the candidate for each political party. And that's just one of many, many, many examples that we can give where institutional reforms don't necessarily end up having the effects that we necessarily want to see. And so, you know, one of the quotes that I love to quote from the founding fathers is, you know, it's also from Madison, this idea that, you know, what is government but the greatest of all reflections of humankind? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. You know, with this idea that part of what government, the structures of government or structures of our political system are supposed to do is be able to help people call in their better angels to sort of figure out how they can work with each other in this project of self-government. And I think that's where civil society institutions become really important in helping to equip people who are not naturally inclined to work towards common purpose, to look beyond their self-interest, to engage in the kind of deliberation that Dan is talking about, that if we assume that we need that deliberation to occur, not only at the level of elected officials and the governments that we have, but also amongst the people themselves, then where are the places and the opportunities that people have to do that work? And one of the things I worry about is I think that increasingly we've lost more and more of the kind of opportunities that people have in civil society to engage in that kind of deliberation. And so a lot of the scripts that people have for how they should behave, I think, tend more towards a kind of extremist activism as opposed to a kind of deliberative process through which people learn to engage with their fellow citizens in the work of actually solving public problems together.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Dan, as you just heard Harry's thoughtful response, it sounds that you both are agreed that the founders wanted to create a system that promoted slow and thoughtful deliberation. But Hahrie argues that today, many of our democratic institutions have become polarized and no longer allow for that kind of citizen participation that the founders envisioned. Do you agree with that? And when you contrast the deliberative institutions at the times of the founding, from state constitutional conventions to the committees of correspondence to the slow deliberation in newspapers that Madison thought would spread the commerce of ideas slowly across the land, when you look at our institutions today, do you agree with Hahrie that many of them are broken, and what would you do, Dan, to increase the deliberation that Madison thought was necessary today?
Well, I think there's two answers to that, and I do agree with a good deal of the diagnosis. I mean, I think on the one hand, one answer is something that the founders took for granted, that we have lost some of now, which is probably best described by Tocqueville, right? Which is the idea of Americans as people who were kind of, part of self-starting community institutions that were organic, that were not governmental, that would get together and do things. Americans were great joiners. And so, I think the more that we have kind of atomized into individuals who, today even sort of shop at home, that people aren't, that people were traditionally much more involved in community organizations and churches, and other things that got them out and engaged in pre-existing institutions that could then, sometimes engage in political activism, but that weren't created and didn't exist solely to do political activism. That even, that your church, your labor union, all these different organizations, your chamber of commerce, that these things existed for reasons that were independent of politics. And certainly you've seen some of those organizations that used to be like that just became purely political. The National Rifle Association was designed, politics was sort of an afterthought, although it was designed really to teach marksmanship to Northerners after the Civil War, and became much more aggressively political. Now, partly that was defensive, just as many of these organizations have done so in a defensive mindset. But I think you need to get some of that back. The other problem I think that we do have, I mean, look, I still say that the greatest single cause of polarization in this country has been the massive increase over the past century and half century in the number of issues in America, particularly social issues, that are decided nationally by the federal courts rather than by the elected bodies, and often done so without ever having gotten the consent of the people, right? They're not upholding a statute passed by the people, but they're also not doing so on the basis of some understanding of the constitutional text that was originally authorized by the people. And so, you have a diminution of both state power at the expense of the federal government growing at the expense of the states, and the unelected part of the federal government growing at the expense of the elected part. And that, I think, does force people into judicial decisions are always a yes/no thing. And so, that raises the stakes enormously. I think if you look at the federal government, there's a number of ways in which it has diminished the role of the ability of the individual voter to make a difference, right? I mean, we've seen a great growth in the bureaucracy, federal bureaucracy. And I mean, I think actually the Trump administration was provided many very vivid examples of the bureaucracy simply refusing to listen to the elected president. And, even if you think that those were sort of righteous decisions in the individual case, in the aggregate, that's what leads to further kind of populist explosions of rage, in the sense that if you win an election and you can't even have the executive govern the executive branch. And then the third way in which at the federal level, we've seen a real diminution of what the framers designed is the budget. I mean, it used to be that you need, filibuster or no filibuster, you needed the affirmative. Every penny that the federal government spent every year was authorized by a budget that was passed through the House of Representatives that was elected every 2 years, right? And so traditionally, if the executive wanted to do anything at all, they needed a budget to pass. They needed appropriations to pass Congress. They needed the affirmative consent of a majority of the House of Representatives, right? And today we have, first of all, we have an enormous amount of our federal budget devoted to debt service, right? So that's money that's right off the table. So, whether you want to build, bombs or schools, you can't spend that because it's already paying for interest payments. But on top of that, the growth of entitlement programs, the enormous growth of entitlement programs, right? Look at what happened to Obamacare. You had from 2011 to 2018, you had a majority of the House of Representatives that looked at a major federal program and said, we don't want to do this. We don't want to spend the money. And yet the money got spent. The money spent itself essentially because the people who elected that House majority were told, no, you need 60 senators and the president simply to not spend money. The whole system was designed so that the people's house could immediately say, let's not spend the money. And so, you have a bunch of these ways in which we have drifted from having the federal government directly accountable to the voters, and at the same time, while the federal government is crowding out state and local governments. And so I think that deters people from the kind of community organization that they would otherwise engage in.
Many thanks for that. Hahrie, you just heard Dan say that things ranging from the federalization of politics, the transfer from the local level, the budget process taking place through the bureaucracy, and the transfer of issues to the courts can make people feel disempowered at the local level. Tell us now about the case studies in your important new book. You focus on grassroots organizations in Arizona, Minnesota, Ohio, and Virginia that have been able to build capacity by engaging constituents in democracy and translating those actions into effective political influence. Give us a case study or two. You talk about the effort for the minimum wage in Arizona and other examples so that we have a concrete example of how people actually can feel both empowered and deliberative in a well-functioning democratic organization.
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely give you an example. Just one thing I wanted to touch on before getting to that is, I think part of what Dan is pointing to, which is really important, is that, political actors are always going to use the institutions that they have strategically. And part of what we're seeing is that, different partisan actors within government are manipulating the institutions for their own goals, and that happens on all sides of the political aisle. And I think those are part of the distortions that we began to think about when that were motivating the book itself, which is that, I think at least, my interpretation would be that the original read of how democracy in America was set up is that not only do you want the political actors who are in government to be able to use those institutions strategically, but the people should be able to also, that people should also be able to have voice in the political process themselves. And part of what we wanted to understand is how can we renew the ability of people to do that? And so one example, to your point, is one of the cases we looked at, for example, was an effort in Cincinnati that was trying to develop a universal preschool program for the city. And so this project actually began way back in 2000 when there was a police shooting of an unarmed Black man in Cincinnati that sparked 3 days of urban unrest, the largest unrest since the LA Rodney King riots in the 1990s. And it sparked a citywide discussion among elected officials, among business leaders, philanthropists, policymakers in the city to try to figure out how can we address not only the immediate cause of the situation, but the long-term situation that led to this kind of, anger erupting for 3 days in our city. And one of the things they pointed to is that Cincinnati is a city that has really high rates of racialized poverty, really high rates of inequality. Cincinnati, along with having really high rates of racialized poverty, also has more Fortune 500 companies per capita than New York, Boston, DC, San Francisco, any of the other major cities in the United States. And so you had this city that had very unequal outcomes. And so some of the city leaders came together and they said, well, what the research shows is that if you want to combat persistent intergenerational poverty, one of the most effective things you can do is invest in early childhood education. And so they tried for years to try to get early childhood education passed in the city, and they weren't, able to do that. They started with trying to have a private initiative for early childhood education, realized they wouldn't be able to reach enough children, tried to get a public initiative passed, but couldn't get city council to support the funding that it would take to build this program. And eventually what you had was an organization called Amos that was a grassroots organization that was organizing through faith communities in the poorest communities in Cincinnati, who built a real base among the people who needed universal preschool the most. So these are the poorest communities that really would benefit from having a public preschool program. And they entered into the conversation around 2013, 2014, something like that. And they built a constituency of people that was really engaged in what it meant to have universal preschool. And so these are, Black leaders from the community, home care, home health, daycare delivery leaders, church leaders, faith leaders, all these different kind of people. And they basically entered into coalition with the policymakers, with the business leaders, all these different people who are trying to advocate for universal preschool. And they had a debate over what did they want that bill to look like? What do they really want universal preschool to look like? And one of the key incidents I'll point to is there was a big debate, I think, within the coalition about how should universal preschool be funded. The Amos, which is the grassroots organization, they wanted it to be funded by a wealth tax. The business leaders absolutely refused to allow it to be funded by a wealth tax. The Cincinnati public school system, who was also involved, they wanted to decouple funding for universal preschool from funding for the school system. So you can see that each group kind of had its own interests that were playing out. And this is one of those moments where the whole coalition could have fallen apart. It came to a head around a certain set of decisions they were making about how they should think about structuring the funding mechanism for what was going to become a ballot initiative for universal preschool. And the whole coalition could have fallen apart about this because they had such deep disagreements. And what Amos ended up doing is saying, you know what, let's call a meeting where we're going to have the business leaders, the policymakers, the school officials come to one of the big churches in our community, and they're going to sit down and they're going to have a conversation with our leaders, which are, these are kind of, a lot of the leaders in the poor Black communities in Cincinnati that don't normally get an audience with the CEO of the Cincinnati Reds, the CEO of the Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And we're going to have a conversation about how we're going to figure this out. And so they were able to pull together a meeting where 300 people from the community came. The leaders from all the biggest institutions in Cincinnati came. They sat on stage in the church and they answered questions from the constituency. And by the end of it, they were able to reach a compromise agreement for a funding mechanism for this bill that allowed it to go forward. And so then what ended up happening is that in the 2016 election, the ballot initiative was on the ballot. And even in this very contested presidential election that we saw, the ballot initiative passed by a 24 percentage point margin, which is the largest margin for any new education levy in Cincinnati history. And I think that happened in large part because all these different groups were able to come together, even in these moments where the whole project itself was about to fall apart. And part of what we highlight in the book is that meeting was only able to happen because of all the work that Amos had done in 2014 and 2015 to really educate and build a kind of constituency that was able to engage in a toe-to-toe conversation with people like the CEO of the Cincinnati Reds about how they should fund a bill like universal preschool.
Many thanks for that powerful example. Dan, what do you think of Hahrie's example of Amos, this faith-based grassroots organization in Cincinnati that through organizing a coalition among people of faith and people of color managed to get support for this tax initiative? Is this an example of Madisonian deliberation of the kind you support? And then maybe put on the table some of your own proposed reforms for resurrecting guardrails of democracy that would promote Madisonian deliberation in the way you think best.
Yeah, I think to some extent it is an example, although I confess that I remain skeptical of using the referendum process for budgeting. I think if you look at, say, the state of California, you see how taking budgeting decisions away from the legislature, for example, through series of referenda, can have a real downside. So certainly this is a success story in terms of organizing, but it is something that obviously took a fair amount of kind of popular deliberation. But I think it is also something that can be a double-edged sword when you start using the referendum process to create projects and sort of remove them from the purview of elected officials rather than persuading your elected officials to take responsibility and ownership for them. I think actually there's a fascinating case study building right now in the intersection between popular organizing and deliberation, and that is the grassroots campaign against critical race theory being taught in schools. Because you have, first of all, I think there was a lot of pre-existing frustration and anger out there, some of which I think was accelerated over the past year as parents got more direct exposure to what their kids were being taught in schools. And I think some of that was unformed. And I think, first of all, just giving people a name and a rallying point to understand that, look, this is something that's happening in a bunch of places, and you have a vocabulary to discuss it, and you can get involved with other people who are concerned about it. I think that's the beginnings of a process. And it's a process that maybe has evaded popular scrutiny. I mean, school board elections, for example, are notoriously often scheduled in very odd times of the year and poorly publicized, so that the interests of the teachers, get high turnout, and maybe the parents don't really even know much about the candidates and that sort of thing. And at the same time, I think there's a deliberative function that has to go on here, right? You have state legislatures rushing to pass bills. Some of those bills are not terribly well thought out. Some of them are better thought out, right? They're struggling with those questions, right? Like, should we really take this issue away from local governments if we're going to try to prohibit something? How do we do that without trampling free speech liberties? How do we do that in a way that isn't either overbroad to where we're banning people from teaching all sorts of simple things, or under inclusive where you pass a ban and then 2 years later everybody says, well, they just ran right around that, right? So you have that process, and of course there are people who want to talk about this stuff at the federal level, and is it really appropriate to get the federal government involved in local curricula? So I actually think it's actually it's a wonderful case study in that bubbling up of popular frustration against institutions that have maybe evaded popular scrutiny, and yet trying to grasp their way towards how do we organize people together, some of whom maybe are people who haven't really been political before, but people get political in a hurry when their children are involved. And then how do you do that in a way that works through the deliberative system, that doesn't get quashed by the courts, that doesn't get gummed up in some administrative bureaucracy, but actually proves sustainable, and that brings out the people who actually are going to attempt to develop an organized grassroots pushback on the other side if they want particular things taught in the schools. And so I think I think it's actually a great object example. I mean, in terms of reforms, I mean, I really think that we do need to reform the federal budget process and return more elected official control over the bureaucracy. I think reaching a more measured approach to the judiciary at both the state and federal level is mostly a personnel matter more than something we could do through systemic reforms. But that's certainly been a long time conservative project to try to get courts to be more originalist and textualist in terms of saying, wait a minute, where do we really have the authority to make decisions in the first place? Maybe this is something that the people either decided already or have or are allowed to decide.
Fascinating. Thank you for all that. Hahrie, Dan raises an interesting question in the critical race theory example. And of course, without taking a position on the substance, do you agree that this grassroots effort, which struggles about whether it should be decided at the school board, local government, state government, or federal level, is an example of mobilization? And more broadly, help us think institutionally, how do we identify when particular sets of institutions are functioning properly in ways that empower people? And can that take place at all levels of government, or does it have to be at the local level?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really good, interesting example. I think that, so certainly we see on the debate around critical race theory that's going on right now, we see mobilization on both sides. Both advocates and opponents of it are getting mobilized, and that's weighing into it. And to me, that's a classic example of one of the big challenges in how we think about activism around these kind of social issues that Dan raised before, which is that how do we enable the kind of mobilization that we want, where people avoid reflexive reactions to a very politicized topic, thoughtful consideration about what the questions are that are really at stake. And I think critical race theory is one of those questions that have become so politicized right now in our political sphere that you see people reacting on both sides of the debate in a kind of knee-jerk way. I think that is really contrary to some of the points that Dan made earlier on about the deliberation that we really desire in American government. And for me, I think it's hard to, and I think part of why we see that in issues like critical race theory is that at the core of that debate, I think, is this question about inclusion and belonging, and this debate that's going on in America right now about who is the community that we want to construct as a nation, and how do we think about both the history that we teach and also the community that we want to construct together. And so there are all sorts of complex questions about people's own identity, their beliefs around this, and then the ways in which they're getting mobilized into it. But in terms of the question of how we think about how institutions function in that domain is one of the things that I think is really interesting to consider is a difference between what we think of as institution-based mobilization and self-selecting mobilization. And I think historically, actually, it's been the right that's been a lot more effective in doing institution-based mobilization. The left has done more self-selecting mobilization. I think institution-based mobilization kind of tends to lend itself more to the kind of deliberation in some ways that we're thinking about. And so what is the difference between those? Or if I'm an environmental organization, then what I want to do is go out and recruit other environmentalists to my cause, right? So people self-select based on agreement with a certain set of issue positions into the mobilization. Institution-based mobilization would be more this idea that I'm going to go in to this church community and I'm going to try to organize this church community around a thing that I want to do. And it doesn't have to be a church community. It can be a school board. It can be a workplace like unions do. It can be a gun club like the NRA has done, sort of places where people are drawn into the community, not necessarily because they agree with a particular issue position, but because of some other affinity. And then that becomes the basis through which organizing happens. And one of the patterns that we've seen throughout American history in the 20th century, particularly, is the decline in institution-based mobilizing and an increase in self-selecting mobilizing. And that is part of, I think, where we've gotten to the situation where a lot of the mobilization on really complex issues like critical race theory sort of lends itself to the kind of self-selecting situation where you don't get the nuance in the discussion that you really want. So I think that's one of the challenging dynamics that we see around not only that debate, but lots of other debates that are going on. On the question of institutions and this really good question of, I think the question of how do we know if institutions are working in a way that really does empower people that we want? To me, I think this gets back to the question of what is the kind of representation that we really feel like is both necessary and important to make American democracy work. And one of the real challenges, I think, that right now, the notions of representation that most people have and that through which our system operates are really thin, right? So for a lot of people, government is very remote, and the only mechanism of representation or accountability that they have is a vote every 4 years, at the national level. And that ignores all the many other elections and levels of government that exist in other people's lives. And I think that often doesn't feel robust enough for most people to feel like they have a say in the system. And so part of the challenge, I think, in answering Dan's question to me would be this question of how do we begin to repair and rebuild people's sense that they actually can have voice not only every 4 years, but in lots of other ways throughout the year and at all other levels of government. And that would inherently make government itself operate more the way it was intended.
Very interesting. Dan, Hahrie puts on the table this question of representation. One of our friends in the chat, Merle Orshowski, says, hasn't the internet and news programs, especially on cable, influenced the public's views that they feel they deserve to be able to take a bigger part in government? Dan, the framers' notion of representation was quite filtered. They thought that thoughtful representatives and enlightened journalists, who they called the literati, would slowly mediate for the people, but not allow the people to express themselves directly at any particular time. Is Merle Warshawski correct that the internet has changed people's conception of, how frequently they want their popular voices to be expressed? And what do you think of Hahrie's suggestion that rather than constantly weighing in only at elections, there are a whole host of local opportunities for people to participate directly and to be represented in ways perhaps that the framers might have approved?
Well, I think the internet speech is, look, it's a double-edged sword, but then in some ways it always has been. I mean, the framers had some wonderful, they had some wonderful quotes about, the literati, but then look at what the newspapers in the 1790s actually did, and they were very, very different. The descent into vicious partisanship almost immediately after the start of the Washington's presidency is a bit of a case study on that. I think the internet has definitely made people feel more entitled to have their voices heard, but at the same time, I think it has led to more self-selection and more of a sense that I can sit in my apartment and tweet and connect to people thousands of miles away. And we can all agree together. But that doesn't actually change anything in my local school. It doesn't change anything in my community. It makes me feel more at home with other people who don't like the community that I live in. And so I think in that sense it has, it is nationalized and internationalized a lot of discourse. And that's not always the greatest thing. Because it does pull people away from getting involved closer to home. On the other hand, it does, it certainly does have the benefit of making people feel that they're not alone. And particularly if you are very much outnumbered in your own community, there is that sense that there's people out there who share your views. But even that can be a problem because, I think there's a lot of forms of extremism that had, that you had to spread through like mimeograph newsletters handed out on street corners in the 1980s, and that are much easier to aggregate into, if you have like 3 neo-Nazis in your town, that's not much of a problem, right? I mean, occasionally it can be, but if they can connect to the neo-Nazis in every town in the country, and and like guys in Russia and stuff, suddenly you have a bigger problem out of a much smaller number of people. And that replicates itself all over the right and the left in terms of extremism. So I think the internet provides some wonderful tools. And of course we've seen, increasingly just in the last several years, how the internet can also provide greater tools for government censorship and government control and government orthodoxy, more so abroad, but even at home. And so I don't think that it has been a perfect solution by any means.
Thanks so much for that. Hahrie, Dan makes a powerful point that the internet can give people an illusion of feeling connected. I guess this is what some call slacktivism, supporting a political or social cause through social media with little effort, just activism by likes and tweets, but not actually be engaged or represented, and in fact have that be a mechanism for frustration against their lack of representation. So in what ways do you think that the internet can both be a source of the solution, the problem of polarization and online radicalization? Do you think it can be part of the solution as well? And since we just have 10 minutes left, I'm very eager for both of you to start giving us homework of specific guardrail reforms that you would put on the table to increase the sense of democratic participation. So let me ask you about the internet.
Sure, yeah. So I think the internet is very much a double-edged sword. So there is a way in which it absolutely has made it more possible for more people than ever before to get involved. And from where I sit, that's a good thing, that we want more people to be involved, to feel like they want to participate in the process. But as many have pointed out, sometimes they get involved in ways that we actually don't like, that actually lead to some of the distortions that we're seeing nowadays. And so to me, the real challenge is not, but sorry, one more thing I should add is, as Dan points out, disinformation, propaganda, the use of a bullhorn that people have to spread these kind of things. That's been around for centuries now. What the internet does is it spread the sort of scale and speed at which that information spreads. And so I think the challenge for us is to think about how do we want to create, moderate those kind of public spheres so that it doesn't become this unfiltered place in which people basically bicker, with the most extreme views on both sides. And the currency of value on the internet is attention, but the currency of value in making democracy work is not attention. It's probably something like commitment, or deliberation, or some of these other values. And so the question in my mind really is, how do we begin to construct the kind of places on the internet that allow for the kind of values that we actually want to promote? And I don't think that, I think some of the concern that people have about doing that is, how do we put those, how do we put those structures in place without impinging on things like free speech? And I think that there's a lot of examples that we see throughout history in non-digital spaces where we have been able to do that successfully in the past. And so the question is how we then import some of those strategies and learnings for how we think about creating moderated public spaces within the internet. So part of that is our questions of regulation, but part of it also is how we think about the spaces themselves that we all are a part of and how we create them. And there's some really interesting experimentation, I think, going on by people like Nate Matthias at Cornell and other places where they're experimenting with different ideas to do this kind of work itself.
Thanks so much for that. Just a few minutes left, and this has been so illuminating that I'd love some more concrete suggestions, because you've both had a lot of them. Dan, just for some more guardrails for resurrecting Madisonian deliberation.
Honestly, I talked a little bit about the budget process, and I talked a little bit about the bureaucracy. I think, for example, I think we should probably set more sunset provisions in both federal and state laws so that things require more reauthorizations. I actually think that one of the things that has really eroded a sense of popular accountability and control is the proliferation of federal spending that filters down through the states, right? The federal government giving money to the states and localities. Because I think when the federal government taxes and spends on federal things, the state government taxes and spends on state things, and the local government taxes and spends on local things, people know who to blame. People know who to change. And when you have these various programs that sort of tie all of the branch, the levels of government together without clear lines of accountability, I think that makes people more frustrated that they don't know what to change. And I guess my other guardrail would be to amend the Constitution, with one simple line: "And we mean it."
That is a wonderful proposal, and the Constitution Center recently ran a constitutional drafting project where we commissioned libertarian, progressive, and conservative teams, and the libertarians came up with precisely the same proposal. I can maybe bet which camp you'll fall into there.
Yeah, that line is not originally mine. I confess that freely.
No, it's a fine one, and we appreciate putting it on the table. The project was interesting. Incidentally, it surprised us because both the conservative and progressive teams agreed on two amendments: eliminating the Electoral College and replacing it with a national popular vote, and term limits for Supreme Court justices. No one expected that agreement, but there we have it. Hahrie, are there any constitutional level reforms that you would suggest? And if not, please give us some other proposed reforms for guardrails of democracy so that more institutions can function like the successful state-based and local-based organizations that you have studied.
Yeah, so I think the reform of the Electoral College and the term limits for Supreme Court justices are two great ones. I also, I think there have been different proposals that have been on the table, like expanding the size of the House to allow for, greater representation among more people. Like the House is supposed to be the people's house in a sense. And right now, so many congressional districts have gotten so big that I think people often feel really removed from their elected officials. And so there are reforms like that I think would begin to repair that representational relationship that we began to talk about. I also think that there are reforms that should be considered. I'm not sure exactly which ones I would necessarily advocate for quite yet, but things like ranked choice voting that would enable a greater proliferation of more parties to have say within the political process. The first past the post system that we have right now, I think there's a lot of evidence that it lends itself to the kind of polarized outcomes that we're seeing, and leads to greater gridlock than we might otherwise want. So I think there's sort of things like that we should also be considering on the electoral side, even if they may not necessarily always be constitutional amendments themselves. The last thing I'll just say is that a lot of what we focus on in the book, and that I strongly believe in, is that civil society does play an important role, because even if we were to repair the Constitution, again, just because we build it, people will not come. And so what we need to do is also think about how do we incentivize the kind of organizations that we want that promote a process of pulling people into the political system in ways that we might think of as normatively good for democracy. And there, I think actually Congress has a really important role. And one example that I'll give is, in addition to the National Constitution Center, Congress also has chartered organizations like the National Conference on Citizenship that used to, in the mid 20th century, be a national organization that had local chapters throughout the United States. And that really was what we find in some of the prisons examples that we see. And it used to be that the NCOC was quite active at the local level, and has really become less so over time. And I think there are ways in which Congress can use its role in being able to charter these kinds of organizations to renew that original mission.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Well, we just have 2 minutes left and always end on time. So Dan, I think the last word is to you. I'll ask you, as our first questioner, Elizabeth Jelliff did, could you respond to what you think of ranked choice voting, which of course took place yesterday in New York City? Is that a reform that you support or not? And then please leave our great audience with your final thoughts about how to resurrect Madisonian deliberation in America today.
Yeah, well, I will note I'm not a favor of abolishing the Electoral College, and I'm a skeptic of ranked choice voting because precisely because, well, for a couple of reasons, but one is precisely because it so greatly complicates the process of counting the votes. I think New York City is it may have dodged a bullet if the outcome is clear enough, but when you have a system that already has a lot of trouble counting all the votes on time, adding this much complexity, I think it's a real problem. But I do favor increasing the size of the House. By the way, I think that's a reform that brings us back closer to the original design of the system. I mean, final thoughts. I really think that we just need to get back in the habit of seeing direct accountability. And I would echo I guess the plug for this institution and others like it. I think the debates over things like critical race theory and people talking about 1619 and 1776 and I think getting people back into, Ronald Reagan in his farewell speech talked about the importance of informed patriotism, and he was serious about the informed part. That because this was I guess 2 years after the whole national celebration of the bicentennial of the Constitution. I do think that taking seriously, having a real discussion in the country about what our history really is and what our institutions and values really are about, and having that done both publicly and privately, having it done in schools, I think that is very important, because I think if we think through what exactly we have as our American heritage, I think it maybe will inspire more people to get involved and do something if they can see results. And unfortunately, I think when they get frustrated, when they get alienated, that's when you see kind of these explosions of populist rage, on both sides of the political spectrum, because people don't feel like working within the system works, and it should.
Thank you so much, Hahrie Hahn and Dan McLaughlin, for a wonderful discussion of how to resurrect Madisonian guardrails. Ending by the plug for civics seems exactly right. And not only Ronald Reagan, but George Washington called for education of our youth in the science of government. And that's just what we're trying to do here at the Constitution Center. And although agreement is not the goal of these discussions, we have had meaningful agreement and thoughtful disagreement about the importance of Madisonian deliberation and the ways to resurrect it. Hahrie, thank you for this great partnership. Can't wait for our next panel to continue to shed light, as you put it in your beautiful Prisms metaphor, on these crucial questions involving democracy. So grateful to you for your book and to Dan for joining. And thanks to our great listeners for taking an hour out of their day to educate themselves about democracy and the Constitution. Thanks to all.